In the early 1800s, Beethoven was writing some of his best music. Napoleon was doing some of his best war. In the early 1800s, the Cherokee were living from North Georgia up through South Carolina and North Carolina, in a swath of land that was about 100,000 square miles, with hunting lands in what is now Kentucky. There was a wide variety among the Cherokee in how they were dealing with the encroachment of European settlers. Some Cherokees wanted to keep the traditional ways, and the traditional ways were that the clan mothers picked the chiefs. You had a war chief, you had a peace chief, you had a principal chief, but you only served as long as the clan mothers felt you were doing a good job, and it was the clan mothers who declared war when it was time to be at war. And the way they would do that is they would take a hatchet and they would put it into the rafters of the communal house, one of the gathering places, and there it would stick until it was time for the war to end, when the clan mothers would take the hatchet out and bury it in the ground. So they would bury the hatchet. That was the way you knew the war was over. That was a way the Cherokees had done it for thousands of years, but some felt that you could better survive the encroachment of the Europeans by just being as European as possible. And so some Cherokee were wearing more and more European dress. You'll see on the front of your bulletin a photograph of their principal chief, John Ross. They were building the same kinds of log cabin houses and then two-story houses with columns that the Europeans were building. There was a Cherokee named Sequoyah who decided that he could write an alphabet that would help them write down the Cherokee language. And what he did, and this is an amazing feat for someone who did not read or write, he made a syllable by syllable, symbol by symbol alphabet. So he counted the number of syllables that you needed in order to speak Cherokee, and he made a symbol for each one. And he thought about, is this easy to print? Can people learn these easily? Are they intuitive? Can we make a newspaper out of these? And he just tweaked it until it became easy to print, easy to learn. And between 1809 and 1820, almost all the Cherokees learned how to read and write their language. It's a pretty amazing feat. And they had a newspaper called the Phoenix, the Cherokee Phoenix. Those that wanted to stay more traditional were called the Kituwa, and they decided that they would deal with the encroachment just by leaving. So they signed a treaty with the U.S. government agents and traded their land in North Georgia and the Carolinas and Tennessee, traded their part of that land for land in what was then Indian Territory, what is now Arkansas and Oklahoma. You know, Oklahoma didn't become a state until 1907, but some of you know people who remember what it was like before statehood. So the Kituwa left around 1817 voluntarily, and they took all their stuff, and they took the sacred fire that was the heart of the traditional Cherokee religion. The Cherokee who were left, then there were about 16,000 at the time of removal. They continued to live in their homes. Some of them were farmers, some were doctors, some were lawyers. Chief John Ross was part Scottish, part Cherokee. He was a Harvard grad. Many of the Cherokee went to Harvard. Many of them went to the other universities that existed at that time, and they became business people. They became professionals. They had a very liberal attitude toward marrying into other cultures, and so especially when the Irish came in the 1820s and 30s, the Irish were never treated as equal, as you know, by the English settlers. If there had been a concept of white at that time, which there really wasn't until more recently than that, the Irish would not have been quite white enough for the English. They put up signs in the windows, no Irish need apply for this job, no Irish need to come into this hotel, no Irish allowed in here. And so a lot of the Irish, even straight off the boat, decided to go down to the south. And many of them found the Cherokee a lot more welcoming than the English and married into the Cherokee tribes and were adopted into the Cherokee tribe. So there were lots of mixed blood, quote unquote, mixed DNA, mixed heritage Cherokee. You can find even now red-headed, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Cherokees, black hair, blue eyes, all kinds of different mix of looks for a Cherokee person. Most of them who stayed after the Kituwa left, most of them converted to Christianity. There were lots of missionaries living amongst the Cherokee, and many of them converted to Methodism or Southern Baptist. There was a big group of missionaries there amongst the Cherokee, and they felt very respectful and friendly from what they wrote about the Cherokee people. Chief John Ross felt that the state of Georgia would respect the sovereign nation or the sovereignty of the Cherokees if they had a governance that looked more like the European governance. So he wrote a constitution. He and his council wrote a constitution for the Cherokee people. It looked very much like the U.S. Constitution, and that brought it full circle because the U.S. Constitution was copied from the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. And the Iroquois were cousins of the Cherokees. And so all of the constitutions, U.S., Iroquois, Cherokee, they were all kind of rooted in the Iroquois tradition. One of the things that not many people know is that the Native American tribes enslaved one another. When they would have prisoners of war, they would make them slaves. And they would own them, their labor and their body. And so they were pretty comfortable with the idea of enslaved Africans being brought over, and many of the Cherokees who were wealthy owned slaves. Most of the elite educated families owned between 25 and 30 enslaved Africans, and those who owned plantations by necessity, by economic necessity, owned many more people whose labor enriched them. And so when the Cherokees were removed, the rolls held 16,000 Cherokees and 1,500 enslaved Africans with the Cherokees. They all went on the Trail of Tears together. So the state of Georgia kept trying to have sovereignty over the Cherokee land, most especially when gold was discovered in the hills of North Georgia. As soon as gold was discovered, the pressure was on. Miners came flocking in. They didn't really understand that just because the Cherokee land was not privately held by this guy whose house is right here, this is not his creek, this is part of the Cherokee tribe land. It's held collectively by the Cherokee. The miners were trespassing, trampling, not respecting the Cherokee land. And because there was gold, Georgia wanted that land real bad. There were lawsuits that were filed. Government agents, like the man Ethan was playing in the play, government agents in suits came with lots of papers to try to bully and pressure the people into signing things away. They didn't really understand that the Cherokee could not sign their land away because they didn't feel they owned the land. They were partners with the land. It was a different way of thinking about it. And so the Cherokee Council made a law that anyone who signed away their land would be put to death penalty for anyone who signed away the land. But the pressure continued. One case made it all the way to the Supreme Court in 1831, and the Supreme Court refused to rule on the case on its merits. They said, we are not certain that the Cherokee is a sovereign nation, and therefore it can't sue the state of Georgia. The Cherokee are more like wards of the state of Georgia, and so they can't sue. Then Samuel Worcester, who was a Methodist minister who lived amongst the Cherokee, he began to make noise along with the Cherokee man who was the editor of the paper. And they hired lawyers and sued because Samuel Worcester wanted to use his privilege as an American citizen to help his Cherokee neighbors not get their land taken away. The Supreme Court, in this case, 1832, ruled that indeed the Cherokee, their rights to the land could not be extinguished by the state of Georgia. And so there was great rejoicing amongst Cherokee people until President Andrew Jackson said, I understand that the Supreme Court has ruled this, but I'm not going to enforce it. And if they want to go down to Georgia in their black robes and enforce this, let them do it. So he said out loud he was going to not enforce this law. And so the state of Georgia, with great alacrity, began to push again. They made a law that no missionaries could live amongst the Cherokee unless they had a special permit from the Georgia state government, which of course they didn't give to anybody. And about 11 missionaries said they were not leaving. And the men in suits came and said, you know, this is a mistake. You understand you're going to do time in prison for this. I really think it would be good if you would just back up and leave these people to what's coming to them, and you go back to your own people. And a couple more missionaries caved, and it was down to about 3, and they went to trial, and they were sentenced to 4 years of hard labor because they would not leave. And everybody was hoping, all the allies were hoping, all the Cherokee leaders were hoping, Samuel Worcester was hoping, that when he got sentenced to hard labor, people would rise up and do something. But people were cautious and careful and just didn't want to, they wanted to hope that it would be better. A group, not with Chief Ross, a group kind of bundled together and went over to the government agent and said, we'll sign a treaty. And they signed in New Echota, Georgia, the New Echota Treaty. They signed their land away in exchange for land in the Indian Territory and money and tools and equipment and other perks. And they packed up all their stuff in wagons and left voluntarily, leaving just Chief Ross and his 16,000 there. So many people were speaking out against removal. Henry Clay, a senator from Kentucky. Daniel Webster, a senator, Unitarian. They objected. Lawsuits flew back and forth. Chief John Ross beat a path to Washington, D.C. with his negotiators, one of whom was the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of one of our members, Ron Buford. They tried to negotiate with President Jackson to no effect, and kept coming back home, hopeful, then despondent, then hopeful, then despondent. In May of 1838, the terror began. Soldiers arrived. They said, we really hope you cooperate because we would hate to use deadly force. Don't make us do that. If we do, it's your fault. They said, you may leave with the clothes on your back. Mothers and fathers took up their babies, their children. They bundled the grandparents onto the trail, left the animals in the yard, had to walk to the stockade. Some of them took boats to different forts, and they were kept in stockades that summer internment camps. They were kept there that summer, and many died of dysentery because the conditions were so bad. The soldiers of the government took about 4,000 Cherokees and their enslaved Africans, took them to Indian Territory by boat. And there had been a drought that summer, so the rivers were not good to be boating on, and the slaves had to do a lot of work to try to clear the path for the boats. It was just a nasty mess, and many people died and many people deserted along the way, and some of them got to Oklahoma. The rest of the Cherokees in the stockades petitioned through their lawyers that they be allowed to leave when it was cooler, because it was just crazy to try to travel any distance in the southern heat. And so they were allowed that. And the government made a contract with Chief Ross himself to take the rest of his people on the trail to Indian country, and they gave him money to do it with. He bought wagons, and he divided his people into cohorts, and each cohort had wagons, and each cohort had a doctor, and each cohort had a seasoned leader, and each cohort had a grave digger. And they set out in the fall, and it became quickly one of the most freakishly cold falls and winters ever recorded. And so the people and the children were sleeping in the wagons without any fire or warmth, with still the clothes they had on their backs from leaving in the summertime. And the African slaves had it even worse, were sleeping on the mud, the frozen and melting mud. Many people died along the way. They wouldn't allow them to stop and bury their people during the day, so you had to carry the dead with you until nightfall, and then your dreams were haunted by the sounds of wailing and shovels digging graves. Chief Ross and his family were on a steamboat having a little bit more of a comfortable trip, and yet his wife died of pneumonia along the way, and she's buried in Little Rock. Out of the 16,000 Cherokees and their 1,500 slaves, it is estimated that 4,000 died along the trail, which they call the trail where we cried. Many settlers came out from their homes along the way. There were 3 or 4 trails that the Choctaw, the Creek, Muskogee Indians, the Seminoles, and the Cherokees were taken on, and people would come out from their houses and stand by the road and just weep and beg the soldiers not to do what they were doing. No one was effective in their protest. Even our forebear, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote an impassioned letter to the president, which reads like this, in part of it, he says, "We can only state the fact that a crime is projected that confounds our understandings by its magnitude, a crime that really deprives us as well as the Cherokees of a country. For how could we call the conspiracy that should crush these poor Indians our government, or the land that was cursed by their parting and dying imprecations our country anymore? You, sir, will bring down that renowned chair in which you sit into infamy. If your seal is set to this instrument of perfidy, and the name of this nation, hitherto the sweet omen of religion and liberty, will stink to the world." So, when the Cherokee got to Indian Territory, there were already the Kituah band there, the traditionals. And they had understood that when their brothers and sisters and cousins from the Carolinas and Georgia and Tennessee came, they would all revert back to the traditional forms of government that the Kituwa had preserved and to the traditional religion. But the Cherokees had brought their Baptist church with them. One of their Baptist churches, just piece by piece, they carried it along the trail and put it back together in Oklahoma and started worshiping there. And they kept their constitutional form of government, and the Kituwa were bitter about that. And as soon as the Cherokees arrived, those people who had signed the New Echota Treaty, who were also already out there, you remember the penalty for signing away the land was death. So those people did not live very long after they got there. They were assassinated. There were Cherokees who escaped the removal. Many different tactics were used to escape. You pass as white if you can, or you just melt back into the hills with the Appalachian way of life, which is Cherokee. You eat squirrels and acorns and live in the hollers, and the government men can't find you. There were about 500 who were living on the farm of a white settler. He had been adopted as a baby into the Cherokee tribe, and so he invited many Cherokees to come live on his land where they were not subject to removal. Cherokee culture and Appalachian culture have a strong thread of feuding. And so the tensions between the Kituwa, the Western Band, the New Echota people, and the Eastern Band, the tensions are still there. Those who stayed are now called the Eastern Band of Cherokees. They live in North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina. When the European settlers wanted the land that's now Oklahoma, they just moved the Indians into reservations. So whenever I tell you stories from history, one of my main purposes is to say, it's complicated. It's complicated. We don't really hear that the Native American tribes owned slaves. We don't really hear about that. And yet there it is, it's true. Some of the tribes, when they freed the slaves, adopted them into their tribe. So you have lots of black Cherokees. Some of the tribes did not allow the freedmen to be part of the tribe. One of the biggest slave uprisings happened amongst the Cherokee. The slaves rose up and killed some slave hunters, and bands of Cherokees got them back and killed them for killing the slave hunters. It's complicated. And yet injustice, when it happens, has similar shape, don't you think? Injustice always has this similar shape. Number one, the laws are ignored. Number two, the horrors are dismissed with beautiful languages. Differences are demonized. And then the oppressed turn on one another. The infighting, the self-hatred, does the job of the oppressor for the oppressor. Good people speak up, and the worst things that happen are done by people who are just following orders. Imagine how different our U.S. would be had we been able to envision a future including the First Nations as neighbors and friends. When we see injustice, let's recognize it for what it is. And let's gather our spirit and our power and speak up.